May 5th, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually see the work that they're going to talk about at the Houston Galleries next week, and I'll remind you of that in email. So it's a little bit different format, but very exciting to have our graduate students that are accomplished and getting ready to graduate with their MFAs tonight. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Claire and Noah.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire. Like Tracy said, I'm an MFA candidate that's focused in painting. I'm in my final semester, so like Tracy said, my thesis exhibition will be opening May 5th, which is really exciting. So I want to start off with an installation image of my work at the Contemporary Art Center. These three paintings I actually made last semester, but they contributed like a lot to the current work that's in my thesis exhibition through like material and application, and then of course digital collage. So over the past 3 years, my work has developed through the representations of the digital image, and much of that relationship is to the screen, which for me personally is my laptop. I don't have a television, so all my most of my interactions outside of my phone is through my laptop screen, and it's been like that for around a decade, so it's been a while. My paintings use the appropriated image, which they are mostly lifted from films that I watch, and then also the internet, to accumulate a sense of collective consciousness, which by this I'm thinking about how images are dispersed and experienced through their symbols and visual language, which also is connecting to present and past technology. There's also a connection between the film and my individualized experience, with specific moments that trigger a memory and or an event in my life. So the three main questions I'm exploring while I make my work are: how does film and language come to represent symbols of personal experience and collective consciousness? How do multiple material processes contribute to the final structure of the paintings? And when do the images become a product of something other than their origins? So before I show the next two images, they're film stills, they're a bit gory. I have a high tolerance for gore, but I know that's not the case for everyone. So if you want to avert your eyes for the next couple slides, please do. So one of my first memories of watching a horror film was the chestburster scene in Alien. It's a Ridley Scott film from 1979. So my paintings primarily focus on horror, psychological, and sci-fi films. And this scene specifically, again, it was the first horror scene that I remember watching, and it was one of the first times that I felt such like a visceral reaction to a horror film or to a film in general. I kind of felt like really nauseous while I was watching it, almost like I was going to get sick. I think a lot of that was because I was placing myself within the narrative and kind of thinking about how I would react to seeing something like that or experiencing something like that. And I think that's why I had such like a physical reaction to it. So that event stayed with me, and I began to view film as more of a means of like psychic projection, like I said, like mentally placing myself within the narrative and then having this like highly individualized experience of it. So many of the films I appropriate or incorporate the destruction and deterioration of the body. I prefer to use like older films for reference. They usually range from the 1940s into the 1980s. And it forms my own personal feeling of nostalgia to watch films like this or to use films like this. And also I'm interested in how technology is perceived in those films themselves, especially when it relates to sci-fi films. I'm always interested, like in the film Blade Runner. It's placed in November 2019, and seeing how they thought that technology was going to develop and look like in that film specifically, that's also something I like to think about in my own work. And looking at this image specifically, it's a scene from Videodrome, which is a David Cronenberg film from 1983. He's a body horror director. I like to think about how this specific image or the images I use, how they're from the past, but they're contextualized in the present when I start working with them and appropriating them. And also thinking about how does a gun attaching itself to a hand relate to my individualized experience, and then also this collective consciousness, like societal ideologies or experiences. I also have an interest in the gaze while watching film, and this gets into my work quite a bit, especially through women characters. I like to think about how the figure is looking through the screen, so viewing the lens is like an eye, and then also you're having that connection with the character. Again, having this ability to like attach my personal emotions to something in the film. So going into the process of the work, after I'm done watching a film, or excuse me, during the viewing process, I take screenshots. So there's usually, it's pretty continuous. I get like a lot of hand cramps. So there's around like 2,000 to 3,000 images that are collected in total by the end of the film. So after viewing, these screenshots are taken into Photoshop, and they're stacked one on top of the other digitally. There's usually around like 4 to 6 images, and they're all within the same 30-second to minute interval, like time frame. So it's all usually from the same scene. Sometimes I'll jump around, but not usually. And I also will manipulate color and opacity to like expose the layers that are underneath, blending into like a single and at times like non-representational collage. And recently I've integrated subtitles into my work to produce like a more comprehensible narrative. But are restructured somewhat into like this non-sequential, almost lyrical stream of consciousness. So although language is like an essential aspect to these collages, the figures' expressions and like body movements are emphasized through the repetition of the same image or scene. And these slight movements are like illustrated while also I have an interest in them being like. Okay, so it references the Empire State Building, and I view this as like a symbol that connects to like modernity. It opened in 1931, and it became like an icon for like human achievement. And it was the world's tallest building until the World Trade Centers were completed in 1970, which is something that I'm also going to get into later in my presentation. And for me personally, for my individual experience with this, it became a symbol for like work and leisure for me personally. The last 3 years I lived in New York, I worked at a university on 34th Street and 5th Avenue, which is like right across the street from, from the Empire State Building. So I walked past it twice a day, 5 days a week. So again, it became really highly connected to my concepts of like working, going to a job 5 days a week, and then also leisure. So that's something that it really stands for in my life personally, and a way that I relate to the images themselves. I also like to align like the action of the figures within the image. Like I typically like to insinuate some form of like violence, like a witnessing of violence. So here we have like, you can see this like knife that cuts like diagonally, or it's like a suggestion. Sometimes I think it can be a bit ambiguous. I make them, so I know it's in them. I know that's not always the case for everyone. But the man on like the right side also has this kind of like recoiling action from an unknown source. And then also you have like a birthday cake that's in the center. And I like the idea of creating this tension between two events that seem like dissimilar, and kind of questioning how they do relate to one another and trying to figure out that narrative, especially with like few words given. I do really like kind of like the, in parentheses, like the reaction. That's something that I really like with the text as well. So once the digital collages are finished, they're printed onto phototransparency, which is just like a roll of like clear plastic, slightly frosted material. And then I proceed to like cut the printed images into, they're pretty random. It's a pretty mindless sort of experience and process. It's just like a lot of cutting and then adhering with, I adhere them together with gloss gel medium, which is an acrylic-based medium. And then I begin to like combine and stack them on top of each other to create something that looks like this, and it's like kind of that fragmenting of the image, and it moves back and forth in between clarities, like representational and non-representational, which I think the center image is obviously representational, but then when you go to like the left-hand side, it becomes more of like a color field. So I have an interest in having those relationships to one another and kind of moving in and out of those clarities. So returning to my interest in the gaze, this is a digital collage that consists of only a single image. That's pretty typical if I'm focusing in like directly on the eyes. And the colors have been manipulated to give this slight reference to the iconic film, The Wizard of Oz, which is a film that I found terrifying when I was little. So it's this reference to the Wicked Witch of the West, and it's something like over the past year and a half, that's been really consistent when I am painting women's faces from film. It wasn't purposeful, it just kind of came about, and I just stuck with it. And I also really like the colors, specifically in this piece as well, to feel so like saturated that it's almost nauseating. And I wanted to reflect like the artificial and unnaturalness of the plastic material itself that it's printed on. And the pixelation of the image is emphasizes that it's been like zoomed in on, like that this isn't a complete image. It's something that's been zoomed closer into, so it has that like specific, what's the word I'm looking for? Like attention to it. And then from there, this is like the finished piece using that image. It's zoomed in even more. This is titled They've Done It. So the process of manipulating the transparencies and attaching them to one another with the gloss gel medium again further removes the film like from its source or the image from its source. I think that the texture of the surface, specifically in this piece, comes to represent like the skin on the face, of course. And it has like this undulating texture of describing like a burn or some sort of decay. And the face's expression was something that I was really, really drawn to the most. It has like something along the lines of like disbelief or isolation, and in my personal opinion, like this final existential reflection, kind of having that moment of like thinking back on your entire life. And this is also woven into other works that contain images of like nuclear bombings and like plane crashes, which I get into later. This is why I added like the red tint into the eyes right here. I was interested in thinking about what this figure was seeing with this kind of really intense expression like beyond the transparencies itself. And developing the thesis exhibition with the films I've been using, it kind of created that connection. So the painting's reflective surface, this is a detail shot, but the painting surface, which is like reflective and polished from the gloss gel medium, it's interrupted by the material's collection of dirt. This is because I like take it off the wall, I throw it on the ground to work on it. So it collects a lot of dirt from my studio floor. So instead of like mirroring the transparencies directly, the object kind of becomes this like industrial object, kind of insinuating like this urbanization process, something that's like been discarded or accumulated of discarded material. So like a main contributing reference or inspiration for a lot of my work in my thesis exhibition is the Andy Warhol's video work, or This Is a Film. But it's titled Blowjob. It's a silent film, it's 35 minutes long. And I find this film to be distinct in how it approaches the portrait, where the surrounding environment, for the most part, you can see a little bit of the brick wall in the background, is refused to the viewer, and also the act that's in the title. It just is entirely focused. The frame is entirely on the person's face the entire time. So the eyes of the figure are cast in shadow because the lighting is above the head, making them like both visible and invisible, and we're not really able to confront the person's gaze when they're actually directly staring at you. Because when they look up, you can see their eyes, but when they're looking forward, you cannot. So thinking of this, the painting Without You, I'm Nothing, incorporates similar ideas of how the eyes are addressed in the portrait. As in the previous green portrait, the surrounding environment is removed entirely, and the viewer is only left with like this aggressive but also empty sense of movement, causing the digital aspect of the image to become apparent through like the pixelation. I feel like it makes the pixelation very apparent. This is also a very zoomed in image as well. And although this movement feels as though it's filled with like a great sense of rage, for me personally, that's how I view it, the eyes are again refused to the viewer because of like their vacantness, and they're fully formed, but they're completely interjected by total blackness. So again, it's this idea of being able to see the eyes, but they're at the same time invisible, so you're not able to directly confront them. So going back to thinking about World Trade Centers, what I mentioned earlier, while I use a lot of images from horror and psychological films, I also source imagery from the internet. This specifically is Google searches, which is a typical form. This connects to a form of navigation for me, so like how I'm navigating and finding my images. So it gives like this history of like how I'm moving through the digital realm. And then thinking about how when these past images appear to us, how they do and like their accessibility. And in relation to the previous work, the first one I showed, it was titled "And I'm All by Myself" with the woman in the center referencing the Empire State Building. The World Trade Center is yet again addressed through like appropriation and in physical manipulation. So the background of this work, as I mentioned, is filled with multiple news images from 9/11. This is an event that has consistently entered my work over the past years. This is much more direct. I have an interest in understanding and traversing past images from the news, from when they happened. So these are news images from September 11, 2001. And I am interested in reconstructing them in the present through the act of making. And I chose to use these images specifically. It's a core memory for me. I think it's a lot for a lot of people that experienced it. It was really specific for me because I was at the age where I could understand what was happening, but then I also could not really wrap my head around the entirety of it. So I found that to be an experience that has just kind of like carried with me. And for this piece specifically is when I started to, instead of like kind of stacking the transparencies like next to each other, I decided to start stacking them directly on top of each other and like using an X-Acto knife to kind of like cut through the top transparency to expose the bottom layers. And I was interested in how, like the aggression of that gesture, because it was something that was really fast. Sometimes the transparencies wouldn't cut through all the way, so I'd have to rip it. And that was a gesture that I felt needed to be a part of this piece specifically. And as my work continued to become viewed through more of like collective societal events and experiences, I find the usage of the appropriate image to be like inherently political due to the idea of like ownership and copyright. So by lifting these images and removing them from their source, I can at least try and attempt to deny the primary source its hierarchy status within like the digital realm and being able to manipulate them through my own agency. So this digital collage states a salon for the woman with the sweetest ass in all of NATO, which can clearly correlate to like the dread and anxieties of the present. And it kind of feels like ominous at times, like a premonition, not in any sort of mythical way, through the lingering uneasiness of the language and how we're viewing it in the present. So the sarcasm in this collage is like not very typical in my work, clearly, but I view it as like a form of deflection when I do integrate humor into it. Like often in my own life, I attempt to use like humor as a means of like processing stress or anxiety. It's like that for a lot of us. So also returning to what I mentioned earlier, using a film that discusses like nuclear explosions. I was lifting images from the 1984 film Threads, which kind of like visualizes and describes hypothetical like nuclear holocaust. So this really gets into my interest in dystopia, which for me is always usually tied to some sort of apocalypse or idea of like waiting for something. So dread really works its way into my work through the idea of like an anticipation for an event, which is seen here through the woman's like biting of her nails and the text that says the destruction of life as we know it. So this like startling confrontation is pushed up against advertisements that were also included in the same scene, which makes me like think of them as something that's like futile or in conjunction with like the language itself. And the subtlety of the advertisements in my work does relate again to like the unnatural material of the photo transparency and how they're adhered to the wall. I don't think it's anything overt in my work, but I do think it's worth mentioning its connections to advertising through the material itself and how they're displayed. So the final question I attempt to address in my work, when do the images become a product of other than their origins, is essentially through the working process for me. And their construction, how these shapes, forms, and images relate or do not relate to one another. So a lot of times these collections of images will culminate into an assemblage of atmospheric forms that can be aligned with like color field painters. We have like Ad Reinhardt, one of my favorite painters. And then Katharina Grosse, who's a contemporary artist, not in the same time period as Ad Reinhardt, and abstract expressionists like Robert Rauschenberg. I tend to focus on color through either their slight or like more severe differences between each other and how they react when placed against one another, which is something that's very apparent in Ad Reinhardt's work. And asking myself, do they create this vibrating effect or do they create a sort of static atmospheric effect? So the randomness of the film stills slightly removes their hierarchies. I think that they can kind of be on the same plane for the most part. You have that eye that's in the bottom that sticks out more. I think that this makes their narratives begin to inform one another to develop kind of this overarching, again, like dread or paranoia that's really common in my work. So the movement, sorry, one second. So their movement through space is something I think about a lot too in the final like product of that or the finished piece. They seem to kind of like be floating like one in front of the other, against or behind, which again creates that duality that I was interested in with the digital collages of being static yet moving at the same time. And it feels as though they're like a collection of fragmented debris, giving the work a sense of deterioration, and that they're, again, kind of like thrown around in my studio. They have this like labor related to them. So this is, again, Ad Reinhardt painting. And then I mentioned Robert Rauschenberg. This is one of his sculptural pieces that has like plexiglass. I think this was a work I saw really early on before I started making my transparency work off the canvas. So this was really inspirational to me. And then of course, Katharina Grosse, who is someone, I first saw her work in my undergrad at this exhibition called My Crippled Friend. It was a group exhibition at CCAD, and her piece was, she had a painting on the wall, it was even larger than this. It was massive. It was probably like 12 feet tall and about, I don't even know, like 20 feet long. It was incredible. So that really directly inspired me to work on a larger scale as well. So this piece is titled, How Can You Live With Yourself? It's about 7 feet tall and 17 feet long. This is the largest piece in my thesis exhibition, and I wanted to create this more cinematic experience with the work itself so that it feels like it's kind of like moving around you and you're surrounded by this environment. So you can like literally place yourself more even within that digital image and feel as though, again, you're like moving through a space instead of just like looking into it. And that is all I have, I believe. I thank you so much for listening to me and what I have to say. I really appreciate all of you being here. My discussion question is, how does your experience with the screen or any sort of digital experience affect your work? Thank you, everyone.